Emma had always known that life was not going to be easy. After losing her husband George in a tragic accident, she was left alone to face a world that seemed colder and more unforgiving than ever. The land that once flourished under the care of her husband now felt like a burden. The farmhouse, though still standing, was beginning to fall apart, and the community around her, while offering sympathy at first, had begun to grow distant, perhaps unsure of what to say to a widow who was still standing strong on her own 2 feet. The small town Emma had moved to after George's death seemed to stretch endlessly under the vast sky. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but no one was ever truly close. Emma's heart had always been set on a life filled with hard work and quiet satisfaction, but after her husband's death, everything had changed. The people she had once known as friendly faces now looked at her with pity. Some whispered about how the widow was holding on too tightly to a life she could no longer afford. The truth, however, was much different. Though many in the town had written her off as a woman struggling to survive, Emma wasn't about to let that define her. She had a small farm that she had inherited after George's passing, and even though it was far from perfect, she wasn't about to walk away from it. Every day she worked tirelessly, digging, planting, and maintaining what she could, even as the crops didn't always yield the harvest she hoped for. Her back ached from hours of bending, her hands rough from the constant toil. Yet despite the hardship, Emma had something that kept her going: determination. It wasn't just about the land or the money. It was about honoring George's memory, about proving to herself that she could do it alone. She had no one else, no family to rely on, no close friends to turn to. The farm and the small house with its creaky wooden floors were all she had left. But even as she tended to the fields alone, Emma never complained. There was a quiet dignity in her work, and while it might have gone unnoticed by many, she felt it in her bones. This was her life, and she was going to make the best of it, even if it meant carrying on in silence. One afternoon, as Emma worked alone in the fields, the sky began to change. The weather was turning. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, their dark edges swirling as though the heavens themselves were preparing for a storm. Emma, as always, took note of the signs. She could feel the shift in the air, the drop in temperature, and the growing strength of the wind. The land was about to change, and so was her day. But there was no time to waste. There was still work to be done. As Emma worked, the wind began to howl and the first raindrops began to fall. She didn't hesitate. She knew that in moments like these there was only one thing to do: finish what she had started. The rain soon turned into a downpour, but Emma kept moving, planting seeds and securing the barn as best as she could. She knew how quickly a storm could turn dangerous in these parts. The floods in this region were notorious, and once the rain started, it didn't take long for the rivers to swell and the land to become a raging torrent. Emma had lived here long enough to know what could happen. Meanwhile, a few miles away on his ranch, Thomas was getting ready for the storm as well, though not in the same way. Thomas was a man who liked things done his way: quick, no nonsense, and to the point. His ranch was vast, and though he worked hard, he was often too focused on his own world to take much notice of others. The storm didn't worry him much at first. He'd been through storms before. He was a rancher after all. But as the winds began to pick up and the sky darkened, Thomas realized this one was different. He hurried to his stables, making sure his horses were secure and that nothing would blow away. The rains came faster and heavier, and the once peaceful landscape around him was quickly becoming a dangerous place. Thomas, though used to handling tough situations, had not counted on the intensity of the storm. It was more fierce than any he'd seen in years. His horses became restless in the stables, agitated by the storm and the rising winds. As he tried to calm them, one of the horses reared, knocking Thomas to the ground. The world spun for a moment as he struggled to stand, his legs weak and his head swimming. The rain lashed at him, blurring his vision. With no one else around to help, Thomas cursed under his breath, feeling frustration rise within him. He wasn't used to needing help, but the storm wasn't waiting. The winds picked up again, tearing through the landscape, knocking down trees and causing chaos. Thomas could hear the sound of the river nearby, rising with alarming speed, the water churning violently as it began to flood the valley. Panic set in. He knew that if he didn't act fast, his ranch could be lost. The storm had already begun to take its toll, and with his head still spinning from the fall, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. Meanwhile, Emma, though drenched from the rain and exhausted from hours of work, had seen the storm escalate. She had already secured most of her farm, but when she saw how quickly the river was rising, her instincts told her she had to do something. It was as though the storm was calling out for help. And Emma knew that if she didn't act, the floodwaters would soon swallow the land. Through the howling wind and the deafening rain, Emma made her way toward the riverbank, her boots sinking in the mud with every step. She could see the water creeping up the fields, moving fast and with terrible force. If she didn't do something, the flood would be upon her farm in minutes. As she reached the river, she saw something unexpected, a figure struggling in the water, fighting against the current. It was Thomas. He had tried to get across the river to secure his own land, but in his weakened state he had lost his footing and was now being swept away. Without thinking, Emma rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no time to waste. With the storm raging around her, she grabbed Thomas, pulling him toward the bank with all the strength she had left. It wasn't easy. The water was strong and the rain only made it worse. But Emma had been through hard times before. She knew how to fight when the odds were against her. Finally, with a tremendous effort, Emma managed to pull Thomas to safety, dragging him through the mud and up to the higher ground. She didn't stop to rest. Without a word, she helped him to his feet and began guiding him toward her farmhouse, knowing that they had little time before the flood would reach them both. Thomas, half conscious and overwhelmed by the storm, didn't fully realize what had happened. His body ached, and his mind was clouded by the cold and exhaustion. He had been saved, but by whom? He barely had the strength to thank the person who had saved him. The rain poured down relentlessly, but Emma kept moving, determined to get them both inside before it was too late. Little did Thomas know, the woman he had ordered to get inside earlier that day had just saved his life. Emma, despite the storm and her own struggles, had come to his aid without a second thought. She had acted swiftly, without hesitation, as if she had been preparing for this moment all her life. But in that stormy night, Emma wasn't just saving Thomas. She was saving them both. The rain hammered against the farmhouse like 1,000 tiny hands, each one demanding attention. Inside, the storm outside seemed like a distant thing, fierce, violent, and unyielding. But within the walls of Emma's small home, there was a strange kind of calm. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a sharp contrast to the cold wetness of the world outside. Emma had done what she could to get Thomas inside as quickly as possible. She had dragged him through the rain, every step feeling like a battle against the furious storm. His body had been heavy in her arms, a dead weight, but she hadn't hesitated. There was something in her that refused to let go. She had seen the way the river had tried to pull him under. She had known that if she didn't act quickly, the flood waters would have claimed him, and maybe she wouldn't have been able to forgive herself. Now, Thomas was lying on her couch, still unconscious, with a blanket draped over him to warm his chilled body. Emma worked quietly around him, moving swiftly but gently as though not to disturb his fragile state. She had known the effects of a cold like this. She had grown up on a farm, and had seen animals and people alike fall ill from such storms. The key was warmth, rest, and the slow process of recovery. As the hours passed, Emma kept a watchful eye on Thomas. His breathing had become steadier, and the color was slowly returning to his cheeks. It was clear he was still out of it, and she wasn't sure whether he fully understood what had happened. It wasn't just the cold and the shock of the flood. He had been through a lot that day. His horse had thrown him, he'd hit his head, and then the river had nearly swept him away. Emma had done what she could to stabilize him, but she could feel that there was more to it than just the storm. She sat in a chair across from him, keeping her distance but always close enough to be ready if he needed anything. Her mind, though, wasn't on Thomas. It wasn't even on the storm that was still raging outside, shaking the very walls of the house. Instead, Emma found herself reflecting on her life, on how she had come to this point. It had been nearly a year since George had died. The accident had been quick, sudden, and brutal. One moment they were talking about plans for the coming harvest, and the next he was gone. Just like that. The heartache was still raw, even if she had learned to bury it deep inside. At times the quiet of the house felt too much, and the silence of the land around her seemed suffocating. But Emma had learned to live with it. She had no choice. She thought back to the years before George had died, remembering the good times they had shared, building the farm together, raising crops, and dreaming of the future. Those were the moments she held on to, the memories that kept her going. And though she missed George more than words could say, Emma had made a vow to herself when he passed. She would not let the farm fall into ruin. She would keep it alive even if it meant she had to do it alone. But that night, with Thomas lying unconscious in front of her, she began to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, the universe had a way of bringing people together when they needed it the most. Maybe in some strange twist of fate, she had been placed in a position where she could help someone else. Not just with the land or with hard work, but with something more. A reminder that, even in the hardest of times, people didn't have to face things alone. The storm outside had slowed somewhat, but it was still dangerous. Emma had no intention of letting Thomas leave in such a state. Even though she had 1,000 things to do, her farm still needed attention, her animals needed care. She couldn't just let him walk back out there. Not after everything he had been through. Hours passed, and as the night stretched on, Emma began to prepare a small meal. She had always kept a stock of food in the house just in case. It wasn't much, just some beans, bread, and dried meats, but it was enough to see them through the storm. While she cooked, her mind wandered back to the moment she had saved Thomas. She could still see the look in his eyes when she had pulled him from the river. The confusion, the shock. He hadn't known who she was at first. He hadn't even known where he was. It was clear he was out of sorts, trying to make sense of the situation. But when she had gotten him inside, all he had done was thank her briefly, his words heavy with exhaustion. He had passed out not long after, and she hadn't heard a word from him since. Emma wasn't sure how much he remembered. It didn't matter, though. What mattered was that she had done something, that she had been there when it counted. In the quiet of the house, with the storm still thundering outside, Emma felt a small sense of peace. There was something deeply comforting about being able to take care of someone, about offering a hand when it was needed the most. She didn't have much to give, but in that moment, she had given everything she could. As the evening stretched into the late hours of the night, Thomas began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, the dim light from the fire casting shadows across his face. For a moment he looked disoriented, unsure of where he was. His mind seemed to catch up with him slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "What happened?" he asked, his words slow as if they were being pulled from the depths of his tired body. Emma was there, sitting in the chair just as she had been. She gave him a reassuring smile, one that was both soft and knowing. "You were caught in the flood," she said gently. "I pulled you out. You were unconscious, so I brought you inside. You've been resting here for a few hours." Thomas blinked, still trying to understand. I don't remember much," he muttered, his brow furrowing as he tried to sit up, only to wince slightly in pain. "You took quite a fall," Emma explained. "You'll be sore for a while. You should rest." He looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. There was a strange silence between them, as though he was trying to piece together the events of the day. Emma could tell that he didn't quite know how to feel about everything that had happened, about her saving him, about being here in her home. But in that moment, she didn't need him to say anything. He was safe. That was enough for her. Thomas looked around the room, the dim glow of the firelight dancing in his eyes. He could feel the warmth of the house around him, the soft bed beneath him, and the quiet presence of Emma. The storm outside seemed so distant now, so far removed from the chaos that had brought him here. He wasn't sure what to say, but somehow, he knew that his life had just changed in a way he hadn't expected. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough but sincere. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Emma simply nodded, her gaze steady and calm. "No need to thank me," she replied softly. "I did what anyone would do." But in her heart, Emma knew that sometimes doing the right thing wasn't about what anyone else would do. Sometimes it was about doing what felt right, even when it wasn't easy. As the storm raged on outside, Emma stayed by Thomas's side, watching over him quietly. The storm had brought them together, but it wasn't just the storm that would shape their future. It was what they did with the quiet moments after it had passed. In the midst of the raging storm, Emma had saved Thomas's life, but little did she know he would come to save her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The storm had finally passed by morning, leaving behind a quiet that was almost eerie. The wind had died down, the clouds had parted, and the sun, though still weak, began to peek through the horizon. It was as though the earth itself was taking a deep breath, thankful that the wildness of the night had come to an end. But for Emma and Thomas, the storm was far from over. Their paths, though intertwined by fate and the floodwaters, were about to face another test. This time it was the truth. Thomas awoke the next morning with a throbbing headache, the memory of the flood still vivid in his mind. He was lying in the same room where he had passed out the night before, the soft glow of the morning sun streaming through the window, warming the air in the small farmhouse. His body ached, and every movement sent a sharp reminder that the storm had taken more from him than just his energy. He was alive, yes, but the exhaustion from the night was still settling deep within his bones. Emma was busy in the kitchen, her back turned to him, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. She had been quiet all morning, giving him the space to wake up and adjust to his surroundings. Thomas could tell she had been up for hours. Her movements were quick, purposeful, and there was a sense of quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. After a moment, he pushed himself up, wincing as the soreness in his body reminded him of how close he had come to losing everything the night before. He glanced around the room, taking in the simple but comforting space. The walls were lined with old photographs, some of them faded with time. The wooden furniture, though worn, had a rustic charm. It was clear that Emma had worked hard to keep this house together, even when the odds were stacked against her. Emma noticed him move, and without turning, she spoke softly. "I made you some breakfast. You should eat." Thomas didn't respond at first. His mind was still racing, trying to understand what had happened and what he had learned during the long, quiet hours of the night. He had seen Emma in action, had witnessed her strength and determination firsthand, but what struck him most wasn't just how she had saved his life. It was how she had done it without hesitation, without any thought of herself. It was almost as if saving him was second nature to her. He couldn't help but think back to the days when he had first arrived in the area. He had been a man used to doing things on his own, believing that if you worked hard enough you could make it without relying on anyone else. He had been proud of that independence, proud of the way he had built his ranch from the ground up with his own hands. But now, sitting in this small farmhouse, he realized that there was a certain loneliness in that kind of life. Emma had faced much harder struggles, yet she had never lost her compassion or her sense of duty to others. It was a quality that he admired but had never truly understood until now. Finally, after a long pause, Thomas spoke. "You saved my life last night." Emma turned from the stove, her expression soft but guarded. She didn't want to make too much of it. Didn't want to turn this into something bigger than it needed to be. "I just did what anyone would do," she replied, her voice steady. But Thomas wasn't convinced. He knew that what Emma had done was not something just anyone would do. Many would have turned away, worried about their own safety or unsure of how to act in such a crisis. But Emma had acted without thinking, without hesitation. She had put herself at risk to save him. And that was something that went beyond simple kindness. It was something deeper. "You didn't have to," Thomas said, his voice low. I could have been lost in that river. But you didn't hesitate. You didn't even think twice about it." Emma gave a small, almost imperceptible smile as if she were holding something back. She walked over to the table and set down a bowl of soup in front of him. "Maybe I didn't think twice. But it wasn't about you. It was about the right thing to do." She sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap as she looked at him with a calm intensity. There was a long silence between them as Thomas took the first bite of the soup, the warmth and comfort of the food easing some of the tension in his shoulders. His mind, however, was still spinning. Emma was someone he hadn't understood at all before, someone whose quiet strength seemed to challenge everything he had believed about surviving on his own. And now, as they sat across from each other in the soft light of the morning, he realized how little he truly knew about her. "What about you, Emma?" he asked after a moment, his curiosity growing. "What's your story?" Emma's gaze shifted slightly, but she didn't seem uncomfortable with the question. It was as if she had expected it. "My story?" she repeated almost softly. "I don't know if there's much to tell. My husband George and I worked this farm together. We had dreams, big ones, but then one day he was gone. Just like that." She paused, her eyes flickering with the shadow of old pain, but she quickly masked it. "I've been here ever since. On my own." Thomas studied her, noticing the way she spoke about George. how she still cared for his memory even after everything that had happened. The sadness in her voice was undeniable, but there was also a sense of quiet strength. She had carried on, kept going, even when it seemed like the weight of the world was too much to bear. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly, his voice sincere. "I didn't know." Emma shrugged slightly, as if the apology didn't matter much to her. "There's nothing to apologize for. People move on. That's how it works." There was another moment of silence as Thomas let her words settle. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the need to press further. "And the farm? The land, is it enough?" Emma's eyes hardened just a little, a slight edge creeping into her voice. "The land is the only thing I have left. I work it because I have to. There's no choice. The crops don't always grow the way I want them to, and the animals don't always cooperate, but I can't just walk away from it." She looked out the window, her gaze distant. "This farm is all that's left of the life I had with George. If I give up on it, I'm giving up on everything. And I'm not ready to do that." Thomas was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. He hadn't realized how much the farm meant to her, how deeply she had tied her survival to it. To him, the land had always been a business, a means to an end. But for Emma, it was far more than that. It was a connection to the past, a reminder of a life that once was, and a symbol of everything she had fought to keep. "You're a lot stronger than I thought," Thomas said, more to himself than to her. Emma smiled softly, though it was a sad smile. "Strength isn't always about what you can do with your hands. Sometimes it's about what you can carry in your heart." Thomas nodded slowly, taking in the depth of her words. There was so much about her that he hadn't understood before, and there was still so much he needed to learn. But one thing was clear: Emma was not someone who could be easily defined by the simple stories of her past. She was far more complex, far more capable than he had ever imagined. For the rest of the morning, they worked together in a quiet sort of companionship. Emma showed him the state of the farm, the repairs that still needed to be made, and the crops that would soon need tending. There was a subtle shift between them, an unspoken understanding that neither had expected but both had come to realize. Emma wasn't just a widow surviving on her own. She was a woman with purpose, with a past, and with a resilience that Thomas couldn't help but admire. And somewhere, in the silence that hung between them, Thomas realized something that he hadn't expected to. His life, for all its independence and hard work, had been lacking. He had spent so many years alone, focused solely on his own survival, that he had missed out on something much more valuable: connections with others, the kind of bonds that could lift both of them up, even in the hardest of times. But he wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to change everything. The days after the storm had passed were marked by a strange sort of peace. The sun shone brightly, almost too brightly after the darkness of the night before. But for Emma and Thomas, the world outside seemed to stand still. There was work to do, of course. Emma had plenty of chores to finish, and Thomas, though still recovering from the physical toll of the storm, had offered to help where he could. But there was something else hanging in the air, something unspoken that lingered between them. It wasn't just the quiet of the farm or the sound of the wind brushing against the trees. It was the growing sense that somehow their lives were becoming more and more connected. Emma had always been someone who took care of herself. She had learned long ago that if she didn't take control of her own life, no one else would. Her days were filled with endless tasks: feeding the animals, repairing the barn, tending to the crops, and every day felt like a battle to keep her world from falling apart. But in the days that followed the storm, something had changed. She found herself working alongside Thomas, and though he wasn't as skilled at farming as she was, his presence brought something she hadn't expected: a sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, Emma didn't feel so alone. Thomas, on the other hand, had always lived his life by his own rules. He prided himself on his independence, his ability to handle whatever came his way without needing help from anyone. But ever since the storm, he couldn't help but feel differently. Emma's presence was like a quiet comfort that seeped into his bones. He had never been good at relying on others, but being with Emma, working side by side with her, made him realize that maybe there was more to life than doing everything alone. One morning, as the sun rose high above the farm, Emma and Thomas found themselves working together in the fields. The earth was soft from the rain, and the crops had begun to show signs of growth. It was early, and the coolness of the morning still hung in the air, but the warmth of the sun promised that the day would be a good one for planting. "I'll work on the east side of the field today," Emma said as she wiped the sweat from her brow. "There's still some weeding to do there, and it's a lot of ground to cover," Thomas nodded. "I'll give you a hand," he said without hesitation. Emma turned to look at him, surprised by his willingness to help. He had never been one to offer without being asked, and there was a quiet sincerity in his voice now that she hadn't heard before. "You don't have to help me," Emma said, her voice soft but firm. "I can handle it. There's no need for you to waste your time." But Thomas didn't back down. "I want to help," he said again, more firmly this time. "You've helped me. Now it's my turn." Emma didn't know what to say. She had never been the type to accept help easily, especially not from someone like Thomas, someone who had always seemed so self-sufficient. But something in his tone made her pause. There was no arrogance there, no sense of superiority. It was genuine, and though Emma didn't fully understand it, she found herself nodding in agreement. "All right then," she said, her voice softening. "Let's get to it." Together they worked in silence for hours, pulling weeds, clearing the land, and preparing the soil for new crops. It was hard work, but it felt different with Thomas by her side. There was a rhythm to it now, a shared sense of purpose that made the task seem a little less daunting. As they worked, Emma found herself stealing glances at Thomas. He was focused on the task at hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet determination in his every action that drew her in. She had always respected his strength, his ability to do things on his own, but now she saw him in a different light. He wasn't just the gruff rancher who had come into her life like a storm. He was a man who, like her, had his own scars, his own story, and despite everything he was here helping her, trying to make her life a little easier. The morning passed, and by the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the field was looking better than it had in weeks. They took a break, sitting on the grass and drinking water. Their legs sore from the work. "You know," Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I've never really spent much time on a farm before. I've always had the ranch, but this..." He paused, looking around the field with a sense of appreciation. "This feels different." Emma smiled, her eyes glancing over the field. "It's hard work," she said, "but there's something rewarding about it. Watching the crops grow, seeing everything come to life, it makes all the struggle worth it." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I can see that. I've spent most of my life working with animals, but I've never really thought about what it takes to make the land work for you. It's a whole different kind of effort." Emma chuckled softly, shaking her head. "It is, but it's worth it in the end." For a moment there was silence between them again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, a recognition of the effort they both put into their work, into their lives, you know, Thomas said after a long pause. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day, about the farm and about George." Emma's heart tightened at the mention of her late husband. She had expected Thomas to ask more questions at some point, but hearing it now in the middle of the day when everything felt calm took her by surprise. She wasn't sure how much of her story she was ready to share. "It's all right," Thomas continued, sensing her hesitation. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I think I understand now why this farm means so much to you. It's not just about surviving. It's about honoring the past, about holding on to something that mattered." Emma nodded, her throat tight. She had never been good at talking about George, but Thomas's words hit a deep part of her. He had always seemed so distant, so closed off, but here, in this quiet moment, he was opening up in a way she hadn't expected. It felt different than anything she had experienced before. "It's been hard," Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it feels like I'm holding on to something that's slipping away. But I can't give up on it. I promised George I wouldn't." Thomas didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't have to. There was an understanding between them now, an unspoken connection. They both knew what it was like to carry heavy burdens, to fight battles alone, and to keep moving forward even when the weight of the past threatened to drag them down. After a while, they stood up and returned to their work. It wasn't easy, but they worked in harmony, their efforts intertwined in a way that felt right. There were no grand promises, no declarations of what was to come. But in the simplicity of the work, in the quiet moments between them, Emma and Thomas began to understand something important. They weren't just two people working side by side anymore. They were two people who had found something in each other that they hadn't realized they needed. As the day came to a close and the sun began to dip below the horizon, Emma looked out over the field. It wasn't just the crops that had started to grow again. It was something inside of her, something that had been dormant for a long time, a sense of hope. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The weeks that followed the storm were filled with the kind of quiet that only those who have endured hardship can truly understand. Emma and Thomas continued to work side by side, each of them doing their part to rebuild what had been broken, both physically and emotionally. They still didn't say much to each other about the storm or about the bond that was slowly forming between them. But it was there, an unspoken understanding that seemed to grow with every passing day. The farm began to show signs of life again. The crops that Emma had carefully tended to in the past were growing stronger now, nourished not only by the soil, but by the quiet partnership she had found in Thomas. He helped her more than he realized, whether it was hauling heavy sacks of feed for the animals, fixing the broken fence that had been damaged in the flood, or simply sitting with her during the quiet evenings, talking about anything and everything, or sometimes nothing at all. There was something about his presence that had begun to feel like home, something that made the hard work seem a little less daunting. Emma had always kept her distance from people, keeping her emotions locked away behind the walls she had built to protect herself after George's death. But Thomas had a way of breaking through those walls, not by force, but by simply being there. There was no pressure from him, no expectations. He simply offered his help, his company, and his quiet understanding. And that, more than anything, was what Emma needed. As the days passed, Emma found herself allowing Thomas into her world in ways she hadn't expected. She showed him parts of the farm that were close to her heart, the small garden where she planted flowers in George's memory, the old oak tree that had been their favorite spot to sit and talk. She shared stories of her life with George, how they had built the farm together, how they had dreamed of growing old on this land. It wasn't easy to talk about, but there was something about Thomas's quiet presence that made her feel like she could. Thomas, in turn, shared his own past with Emma. He told her about his childhood, how he had grown up on a ranch not far from here, and how he had always been taught to be independent, to take care of himself and never ask for help. He spoke of his parents, how they had instilled in him a strong work ethic but also a sense of isolation. He had never been one to let others in, not because he didn't want to, but because he had never known how. His life had always been about surviving until now. The more they talked, the more they realized how similar they were. Both of them had been shaped by loss, by the kind of struggle that makes you question everything about the world. They had both learned to keep moving forward, to push through the pain even when it seemed like the world was working against them. But they had also learned something else, that there was strength in vulnerability, that sometimes it was okay to lean on someone else, to ask for help, to let someone else in. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch of Emma's house, the soft hum of crickets filling the evening air, Thomas turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about how much you've taught me. Not just about farming, but about life, about how to keep going when it feels like everything's falling apart." Emma looked at him, her eyes softening. "I didn't teach you anything," she said quietly. "You've taught me just as much. You've shown me that I don't have to do everything alone, that it's okay to let someone in. You've taught me what it means to have a partner, not just in work, but in life." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if the weight of them was too much to carry. But neither of them looked away. They were speaking truths now, truths that had been building between them for weeks. There was no going back. Thomas took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, looking out at the field where the crops were beginning to take shape. I think I've been running from a lot of things," he said slowly. "I spent so much time focused on doing everything on my own, on keeping people out. But what I've learned from you is that sometimes it's okay to let someone in. Sometimes the best thing you can do is let someone help you carry the load." Emma smiled softly, her heart warmed by his words. She had always been the one to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, and hearing him say this was like a weight being lifted off of her. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do it all alone either. Maybe there was room for someone else in her life after all. "I think we've both learned that, haven't we?" she said, her voice steady but gentle. "We don't have to carry everything on our own. We're stronger together than we are apart." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet kind of peace, a moment of understanding that they were both on the same path now, and that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. They began to make plans for the future, not just for the farm, but for their lives. Thomas helped Emma with the repairs to the barn, and together, they cleared out the fields for the next planting season. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks, and there were moments when both of them felt exhausted, but there was also something deeper at work. They were no longer just two people working side by side. They were a team in every sense of the word. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas turned to Emma. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said softly, "about us being stronger together. And I think you're right. I can't imagine doing all of this without you." Emma looked at him, her heart fluttering in her chest. For so long she had feared the possibility of losing everything, the farm, her independence, and her sense of self. But now, she was beginning to realize that losing herself didn't mean giving up everything she had worked for. It meant finding a new way to grow, to move forward. "I don't want to do it without you either," she said, her voice quiet but firm. And with those simple words, everything shifted. It wasn't about the past anymore. It wasn't about what they had lost. It was about what they had found in each other, about the possibility of a new beginning. The future, once uncertain, now seemed full of promise, and for the first time in a long time, Emma allowed herself to believe in that future. The seasons passed and the farm continued to thrive. Emma and Thomas worked together, their days filled with the quiet rhythm of shared labor. They built something together, something stronger than just the land they worked on. They built a life, a partnership, a bond that neither of them had expected but both of them had needed. And as they stood side by side on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. No more alone, not ever again.